and we have returned. And if you're noticing that you're hearing a different voice at the beginning of this, it is because I, Llama, have taken over Homerbound and the MC duties thereof. Welcome to Homerbound, a podcast where a couple of big old nerds read through and discuss Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. As I mentioned before, I am Llama.
And I'm Wriste. Thanks for having me, Llama.
Oh, like you weren't going to be here. We've switched things up a little bit. We've decided, since we're starting with the Odyssey today, that we are going to switch up the duties a little bit and just have some fun with me at the reins. So welcome to chaos. No, I'm kidding. This is going to be pretty much the same as it was before. We are also welcoming Dr. Daniel, our resident expert, back as our lovely, most special guest today.
Thank you.
And
people have forgotten
very
about
glad
that
to have you.
since that joke is actually one episode removed from this, even though we recorded it yesterday. So
Episode 11,
fresh
yeah.
for us.
But I felt the need as the new MC of this here gig
Our
to
true fans will know.
to emphasize that we love having Dr. Dan on. It's a really great time. And what better time than with the beginning of the Odyssey?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So welcome back. And before we truly get into things, I will issue our usual content warning. We are immature. We have potty mouths at times. We make silly jokes. And in addition to that, the content of the Odyssey does contain some violence. It does contain some references to sexual content, some hugging and kissing, as we like to call it. And I think that just about wraps up the content warning, unless you have anything to add, Wriste.
If people remember from episode 11, I described a glass that Dr. Daniel was using. He's actually using the same glass here.
Same glass.
It is rounded, but it also has ridges and a bluish tint. So some trivia for the listeners at home.
It's a classic glass. Doesn't go out of style. Does its job well. So
It's a solid, good drinking glass.
yes, indeed.
And my drinking water bottle is also.
And Wriste still has his water bottle. Someday I might try and convince you to go to a more sustainable option, but we'll see. And I remain with my nice ceramic mug full of what is a tropical tea today.
Tropical tea.
Got a nice tropical black tea with some mango and pineapple flavors going on. It's delightful.
That sounds lovely.
We're so prepared to talk about the Odyssey.
Yes, true.
I am extremely ready to talk about the Odyssey. So part of the reason that we've switched to me emceeing is because of the two books, I was more familiar with the Odyssey. And even though I now have a much greater and deeper appreciation of the Iliad, my real love, I think, in this series is going to be the Odyssey. I love this story. It's fascinating. It's intriguing. It's, captivating. There's more of a journey and kind of traveling element to it than there was with the Iliad. Obviously, we are beyond the Trojan War here. And I just have always loved that, what it quite literally is, the Odyssey. And so this is part of the reason why I'm kind of taking over the reins here, is because I love this book.
Yeah, as Llama said, I'm not so familiar with the Odyssey as I was with the Iliad. I've read the Iliad, the Fagles version anyway, multiple times, maybe close to a dozen total, depending on how you want to count it. I don't know, but the Odyssey, I'm familiar with the story through cultural osmosis. We've all, as children, probably experienced in one way or another. I have a picture book that I probably opened up. It was depicting Odysseus sailing away from the Cyclops and the sirens, and that whole sequence is just made for children's book adaptation. So I was first introduced to the Odyssey, and then I learned about the Iliad later. So my initial impression of these two epics was Odyssey was the cool hip one, and the Iliad was the more boring but it's their one. And now obviously that's changed, but My familiarity is
definitely.
super limited. Yeah, I've read once, maybe twice. I have some cultural familiarity, but no
And to be
command.
fair, I'm not sure that I necessarily approached the level of having read the Iliad as much as you did. Like, I'm not sure I've quite approached that with the Odyssey, but I've definitely read it a few times. And I definitely had much more of a grasp of it when we started this than I did of the Iliad. So, yeah, let's get started. And part of what I would love to get started with is by noting that we are using a different translation or a different translator of the Odyssey than we did for the Iliad. Obviously, there is a translation of the Odyssey by Robert Fagles, but we have opted to use the Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey. And this was not necessarily a choice I made, actually. Wriste was the one who suggested this. Can you tell me why?
I don't know. It was my introduction to the Emily Wilson translation was it was accidental. I can't actually, still to this day, I don't remember how I ran into it. But there was buzz, I guess. It's a fresh translation. It's from 2018, or published in 2018. And if I understand correctly, Dr. Emily Wilson is also the first woman to have to produce a translation or to publish a translation of the Odyssey. If I remember correctly, Dr. Daniel is putting his finger up.
Well, so I think she goes to pains to say that she is not the first woman to translate the Odyssey necessarily into another language, but perhaps the first major publication release in English, at least.
Yeah, that's why she changed it to published.
Right, exactly.
Because I imagine that other women have taken their stab at it, but
right.
This was like more high profile.
Right.
I thought it was very interesting, and it's also a little bit different from it's a lot different from the Fagles version. It's Dr. Emily Wilson makes a point to follow the as she says, she follows the line count of the original Greek, and it is written in a stricter poetic form. I'm not a analyst of poetry or whatever, so that may be a little bit lost on me, but it's obviously there, and it reads a lot differently. So yeah.
Yeah, I was stunned when I kind of broke into this about just how different it is in tone and structure to the Fagles translation. And actually, hilariously enough, so my parents obviously know that I'm doing this podcast. The other day, my mom came up to me and she was like, "Hey, I found this, and I didn't know if you would be interested to see it. It's the copy of the Odyssey that my sister got, and that we both used. It has her name like written all over it, but I also used it as well. And it's the Robert Fitzgerald translation. And I read through like the first book or so just to see like how different it was, and I could not believe how different it was. Like it was fascinating to me because it just was like reading two completely different books almost. So I am struck by how unique this translation of the Odyssey is. And I think we're going to have great fun with it going forward. I'm curious, Dr. Daniel, if you have anything that like strikes you about this translation that you'd love to tell us about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Wriste alluded to the fact that there's a bit of buzz around this translation of the Odyssey, not only in terms of general publishing news and things like that, but also in classic circles as well, because in classics we're always very aware of, or at least we should be aware. No, we're not always aware, but we should be aware of the biases and the experiences that we bring to these ancient texts. These texts haven't changed in the past millennia, right? But every time you have somebody new coming along, bringing their own life experiences, their own ideas to bear on this text, all of a sudden different things get brought out of the text, things that we weren't noticing before. And Emily Wilson, as a woman coming to this endeavor, has definitely brought up some very interesting things in the Odyssey that people haven't really been talking about before. She's also really great on social media and news articles talking about her process for translation as well. So looking at how she goes from this ancient Greek word, for example, this adjective for Odysseus, polutropos, literally the man of many turns. How does she turn that into a complicated man, as she translates in the first line of the Odyssey, right? I just think that it's a really fresh, awesome take on the Odyssey, and I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of really great conversation around the choices that Emily Wilson made in her work.
And just as like a general aesthetic reader point, this is very. We've talked about how easy or how nice a read Robert Fagles is. That may be exaggerated a little bit because at this point we're used to having read that. There's obviously some just formatting things in the Fagles trend. Like it looks like just a block of text.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to sort of parse through that in your head. There's not a lot of white space. So just from a design and approachability perspective, Dr. Emily Wilson's translation looks easier to read and is in many ways much more approachable than even something like Fagles, who, as we've said, is like a really delightful read, just in general, I think.
Yeah,
for sure.
I absolutely I had such a great time reading this translation, and I'm really excited to talk about it. And so with that, I think let's hop into book 1 of the Odyssey, which is titled The Boy and the Goddess, and begins with what I believe is another poem.
Exactly.
Am I correct?
Yep.
So the first 11 lines of this are a poem, and starting with "Tell me about a complicated man," which I just love that as an opening line. This is another one of those things that almost kind of tells you so much about what this story is going to be, what we're going to see, much in the same way that, the Iliad starts out with rage. And that tells you really a lot of what you need to know about the Iliad.
Yeah, what's really cool about this first line of the Odyssey in particular, so I think I've alluded to this in the Iliad episodes, but the very first word, in fact, of an ancient epic often tells you what the story is going to be about. So the word menin, wrath, was the very first word of the Iliad, because in ancient Greek, word order doesn't quite matter as much as in English. So in English, we go subject, verb, object, but in ancient Greek, we can go object, verb, subject if we really wanted to. So sing of the wrath of the son of Achilles. That's how the Iliad starts off. Here in the Odyssey, the very first word is andra, which is where we get words like androgynous and words like that. Here, andra meaning man. So tell me about a man. Tell me about a guy, and specifically a polutropon andra, a man of literally many turns, which is what the Greek says. So I'm interested to see what how this word "complicated" is going to play out in Emily Wilson's translation.
If we want, so there are a couple things that there's one thing I guess that first stands out to me, which is that in the Iliad, we start off with the rage of Achilles, and then we immediately smash cut to Achilles. But we don't get that here. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but we've talked about
we ever don't do that.
Well, in the Iliad, we talked about how we were introduced to Achilles. We're sort of we're given an Achilles tease, and then he just vanishes for a portion of the book. This just jumps right to the vanishing point. We hear about Odysseus, but we don't get Odysseus, and so
except through references, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so when it says, when the poem says, "Tell me about a complicated man," we don't hear about the complicated man firsthand, or as firsthand as a story can be, I guess. For I think it's 6 books. We don't see him.
It's quite a while.
It's for quite some time. And what I kind of love about it, though, is so the beginning of this proem we've talked about, but I love the end of it as well. So the last couple lines of this proem are, "Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning." So that's kind of telling you exactly why you're not going straight into Odysseus. You're finding the beginning of the story. You're getting the background. And I love that it kind of just starts, because this is much more, to me, of a story being told to you than the Iliad was. Like, to me, the Iliad felt very much like you being able to read a sequence of events. But there are many times while reading the Odyssey where I felt like there's literally a storyteller here telling you a story. We get this in the Iliad because you have the poet, the narrator. But to me, those felt more like interjections of the narrator kind of literally telling you something, whereas for me, at least, in this version of the Odyssey, it really felt like it's telling you a story. Like, you're almost kind of sat down on a bed, you know, getting ready to sleep, and a parent is telling you a story. That's just kind of a feeling I got from it.
Kind of in the sense of like a novel, almost like a more straightforward narrative in that way than the Iliad, or is that how you characterize it?
I think so. Okay. Yeah, I felt like it was a lot more. I keep reaching for the word like linear.
Okay,
but I'm not sure it's linear that I'm looking for. I'm not exactly sure what the word is but it felt more straightforward. It felt
a clearer structure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it felt less convoluted and confusing at times.
Yeah, I think if we were to think of this in terms of like theatrical terms or dramatic terms, it might be something like it might have a clearer through line, like a clearer like point to which the story is driving. Because with the Iliad, we get this sort of like shouting match between Achilles and Agamemnon, and then it sort of like drags on for the next like 16 books, right? Then all of a sudden the story changes and it's all about getting revenge for Patroclus. Here in the Odyssey, we have the details of what we're looking at. We're going to hear a story about a guy who's trying to get home, and we're waiting for that moment to happen and see how it unfolds. So I think maybe that's the other way to think about it too. If you feel that there's more of a driving narrative to it, maybe it's because there's a more clear final point that is driving towards.
I think so. I think that very well may be. Like, I think for me, like, the experience with the Iliad almost left me with more questions than it did answers. And that is not the way I feel about the Odyssey. Obviously, this reading of it, I think for me, has brought up more questions than I had before because I'm looking at it from a more analytical lens, obviously, than I did when I was, you know, in high school or even maybe college. But it feels more resolved at the end, even though it kind of ends very abruptly. Getting way ahead of ourselves with that. Let's stay in book one. So we start our story off with basically kind of the story of the end of the Trojan War, in a way. You know, all of the Greeks who have survived the Trojan War get back home safely, except for one.
They get back home.
Yeah, the safely part.
Some of them less safely than others. Yeah. However, it literally says in the first line, all the other Greeks who had survived the brutal sack of Troy sailed safely home to their own wives.
I guess in a sense,
so I'm ripping it
they
from
did
the book.
sail safely, but that safety is very strictly limited to that sailing.
Right, exactly.
You know, like Agamemnon gets, you know, killed.
So let's get into that. You know, one of the first things that we find out is that Agamemnon gets home and is killed by his wife and her lover, Aegisthus. And, and then Agamemnon's son kills the lover. And I did a little happy dance, I'm not gonna lie. Agamemnon, I have always felt, is kind of a dick. And, it's nice to hear that he got what was coming to him for sacrificing his daughter.
What I like about, I guess, the murder of Agamemnon here, that's a strange way to put it, is so when we were talking about Agamemnon before in the context of the Iliad, right, there was some extra textual things that were brought in terms of like whether we should consider Agamemnon a good guy or a bad guy in terms of how he sacrificed Iphigenia and other things like that. What really struck me here is that version of the story isn't really told here. It makes this seem like basically just a marital squabble, where Aegisthus comes in, steals away Clytemnestra, and then they murder him out of a petty lover's quarrel, as opposed to having any other larger implications for it. Clytemnestra
this doesn't even bring up Clytemnestra. I don't believe it's just
right.
It doesn't name her yet. I'm pretty sure she is named in
a later book. Yeah,
books.
I imagine so.
I think. Yeah. When they're in the underworld,
right,
and getting a bigger conversation with Agamemnon.
That's right.
But at this point, she's not mentioned yet. And this is, I feel like, kind of common in the Odyssey that women are mentioned a lot less than men, because there's incredible amount of talk in this book about how important men are.
Yeah, and there are some very important inflection points for that, but we'll probably talk about Telemachus and other folks later on. But
yes,
yeah,
absolutely,
for sure. But yeah, I'm also intrigued by the way that this begins too. We jump right into the gods talking about Odysseus and Agamemnon, and when I was reading this today, I wondered, like, what's the point of bringing up the story at this point in time? Like, what is the connection between, I guess, Agamemnon and Odysseus, besides the obvious, like, Agamemnon got home, Odysseus still hasn't gotten there? And I think, again, not to get too ahead of the story, but I think it has to do with the way you accept people into your home, the way that they're supposed to comport themselves, guest friends, and Xenia and all that other good stuff.
Yeah, this is absolutely one of the greatest themes throughout this story. So, like, whereas in the Iliad, please,
I just say, yeah, and this is, I can't remember if this is mentioned in book 2 or this is in book 1, but I feel as though maybe it's Athena who compares, or is someone, or Telemachus, Odysseus's son, who we'll talk about later, is compared to Orestes, or there's a line drawn.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Yep.
And Telemachus he's not in the same boat as Orestes, who I think was exiled for his own safety or something like that, and then he comes back home and takes revenge and all that stuff. But Telemachus is put in a very similar position, and so I guess if we want to follow the comparison, and I don't know what to make of this, Odysseus is maybe a little bit like, is sort of taking the well, I don't know. Odysseus is maybe taking the place of Agamemnon, or like his house is taking the role of Agamemnon, and Telemachus has to deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a clear parallel there. You know, the husband who has been supplanted by X person or people, you know, the wife who, in the case of Agamemnon, is in on the deal, and in the case of Odysseus is not. And the wronged son, the wronged child, the future of the house. So to get back to what I was saying before, though, like, one of the themes, the big themes of this book to me is home and, like, hospitality. This is honestly, for me, like, a huge tale of morality, of how do you treat people in a society? How do you treat the guest who comes into your home? How do you treat the owner of that home? You know, in the case of the suitors against, you know, Telemachus. So this is one of these themes that is woven throughout the entire book, is talked about frequently. So I think part of it is to, the Agamemnon example is to start putting that seed in people's head of, you know, this is the wrong thing to do in someone else's home. Just take their wife and, you know, lord it over their kingdom and kill them. It's bad. You shouldn't do that.
Generally bad idea.
Although Athena does say that he deserves to die, and I agree.
Although, I would like to focus really quickly on, so this story that we're hearing is told in the context of, where we're talking about the gods talking about it, but this is basically Zeus complaining, or having he's huffing and puffing about how mortals are stupid. They blame the gods for everything, and this is especially poignant to me because in episode 12, I think I had like a minor breakdown concerning like what agency really means in the context of Homer, of Homer's world, and like if we can even sensibly separate the free will of mortals and the free will of the gods. And so this is,
and I think one of the things that Zeus says at the very beginning here is really important to that. Yeah. Because not only does he say, you know, he says they say we cause their suffering, but they themselves increase it by folly.
Yeah, and even though from what I understand in the epic cycle, the Odyssey is like probably a few stories removed from the Iliad, it is maybe serendipitous that this is the only other one we have, because this is addressing a lot of the questions that I think people, if not just us. I imagine like the question of agency and free will and stuff like that is a common source of discussion in the Iliad, and so this like directly sort of addresses that, and we could probably mine this for meaning forever. But I like that this is, we have the proem, which is introducing us to Odysseus, but I like this statement as a equal, if not more interesting, guiding force throughout the story. This idea of people making choices and to like keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, I think this opening conversation occurs between Athena and Zeus. And what they end up getting onto is Athena starts saying, "Oh, I feel really bad for Odysseus. He's having a really tough time." Because Poseidon is very angry at him. And begins to kind of rant at Zeus about, like, how could you forget my dude Odysseus? Because as we will establish further and further throughout the Odyssey, Athena really likes Odysseus. And I know we have talked about this a little bit before in our discussion of the Iliad. They are homies. Like, Athena really, really likes Odysseus. She sees, I think, a lot of herself in him. The cunning, the wit, the, kind of mental strength, which she is known for, and as is he. So it stands to reason that she's sitting out there watching over him and kind of lamenting about his unfortunate fate.
Yeah, the hominess of Athena and Odysseus is not just here in the Odyssey either. I mean, there are also Greek plays and whatnot that play on this idea too. The play Ajax by Sophocles that dramatizes the judgment of the arms, which we talked about before, where Ajax and Odysseus try to lay claim to the arms of Achilles. That play opens with Athena and Odysseus chatting, basically. Athena and Odysseus, homies for life.
And then from there, it basically kind of goes into Zeus telling Athena they need to come up with a plan. How are we going to get Poseidon to relent in his anger, and how are we going to bring Odysseus home? And Athena is all about it.
Yeah, and also, and I can't remember where or how this is depicted, but we also have, I guess, Calypso. Calypso has trapped Odysseus on an island, and she wants him to hang around with her forever, and so that's another, I guess, thing they have to sort of pry away. I keep getting Calypso and Circe mixed in my head because they're very similar in terms of what
their narrative
want out
is.
of Odysseus.
Yeah.
Yes. So we'll get glimpses of Calypso, and then we'll see echoes of her in Circe, I think. Anyway,
yep.
I'll get to critically examine that when we get there, but in my mind, that's how it works.
Yeah, so then it's sort of like the two-pronged plan of attack at this point, right? Somebody needs to go to Calypso, somebody needs to go down to Telemachus as well, to get the story going.
Well, I think it's interesting that Athena's... Oh, wait, no. Zeus sends Hermes
down to Calypso.
Yes.
Yep. And Athena gets to deal with Telemachus, which I think is a little odd, I guess. I feel like Athena would have more of an affinity for Odysseus, so she'd go to Odysseus because she wants to hang out with him or whatever. And Hermes, I don't know what relationship Hermes has with Odysseus.
I don't know.
From understand, like, they're both cunning, but
I don't know that Hermes would be sent down for any affinity with Odysseus necessarily, as much as just Hermes is the messenger god. He gets to deliver the news, and I think that Athena can trust that Hermes will get that job done. So she's busying herself about with other things that will affect Odysseus materially, namely what happens at home. Whether he's going to have a home to return to basically depends on how Telemachus acts at this point. So I think that's why Athena makes a point.
Yeah, because the message that Zeus is telling Hermes to send is to Calypso, not to Odysseus. Yeah. So basically, his job is to go down there and tell Calypso that the time has come. You got to give him up. We know you like him. but you have to let him go. He is wanted
Yep.
at home. And Athena basically goes to oversee the saving of Odysseus's house, which is something that I imagine, since she likes him so much, she has a very vested interest in. And so she takes the form of Mentes, a Taphian leader. And this is one of the first of very many uses of
Yep.
guest friend.
Yep.
So can you introduce to us a little more about the meaning of a guest friend?
Absolutely. So this is an idea that came up in the context of the Iliad, but it's much stronger in force here. And pardon me while I just make sure that I can find the Greek here. Okay.
There's nothing that makes me happier than you searching for the original Greek. Can I just say that?
I'm glad to oblige. And yes, okay, I have it right here. Great. So this term guest friend is the noun version, or one of the components of a larger idea of guest friendship, which in ancient Greek is a term called xenia. Xenia is guest friendship. Xenos or xenos is a guest friend. And what it is this system wherein you as the host of a home, or you as the head of a household, need to accept any guests, any travelers that come to that house, put them up for the night, give them a nice meal, give them whatever they need as a sign of goodwill. And there are obligations from the host to the guest and from the guest to the host as well, in terms of respecting the household, respecting the material goods of the household and the members of the household as well. So the appearance of this word here, guest friend, xenos, is very pointed. I apologize if you could hear a fire alarm in the background. Yeah, sorry. Let me just mark down where this is if we want to cut this out later.
Oh no, this is fine. The chaos adds to
I
the.
said let chaos reign, so I stand by that statement fully.
The chaos adds to the feel of the podcast.
All right.
Don't worry about that.
Okay, so it sounds like a plan. Thanks. All right. So guest friendship, or xenia, is a very powerful bond in ancient Greek culture. Those who are bound by it, this bond lasts for generations, households, which is why Mentes is able to say, hey, our families are connected because our ancestors or our fathers were guest friends of one another. So the term that's used here is exactly that, xenos, being used to describe Mentes here as a guest friend of Odysseus' household.
This is exactly that bond that was uncovered between Ajax and Glaucus in Book 6 of the Iliad, right?
It was Glaucus and Diomedes, I think.
Oh, it was Diomedes, excuse me.
Diomedes, yeah.
Diomedes, you're right.
Diomedes and Glaucus, yeah. So exactly it. That's the same. This is the same theme that we're dealing with here, but whereas it was sort of like a convenient narrative situation in the Iliad, here it's basically, I think as Llama was saying, kind of like the core of the entire story.
This is a central narrative to the Odyssey. I mean, this gets washed out over and over and over. The amount of times that they talk about this is like dizzying.
Exactly.
I wonder if you could actually count them all up, like how many you'd end up with. I'd be willing to bet it's in the hundreds. Honestly.
So many. Yeah, I mean, just do a control F on the text to see how many times Xenos or Xenia comes up. But yeah, in lots of different contexts too. I mean, again, not to get too ahead of the story, but I mean, Odysseus in his travels is basically looking for Xenia from the folks that he interacts with. He does not interact in a very Xenia-like way with Polyphemus, the Cyclops. The suitors are not engaging in the rules of Xenia based on the way that they're comporting themselves in the household of Odysseus in his absence, and particularly in the way that they treat Telemachus, who's supposed to be the sort of the dude of the house at this point. So yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I love is that we kind of open up in this first book with two polar opposite examples. So Mentes comes in and is greeted by Telemachus as a guest friend, as in the perfect way, basically in the ideal way, invited in to feed and bathe themselves and basically do whatever they need to do to make themselves at comfort. And then you are immediately presented with the contrast to that, which is these suitors. All of these men who have gathered around to hit on Telemachus's mom and ultimately woo her into marriage, much to her chagrin and Telemachus's chagrin. And they are eating all the food. They are using all of the fine, rugs and clothing, and they're just taking everything and absolutely making a mess out of this house.
Absolutely. If there's one thing you do as a Xenos in somebody else's house, it's you don't do that. You don't eat up all the food. You don't ravage the livestock. You don't wipe your mouths on the fine linens and things like that, which is exactly what the suitors are doing here, for sure.
So one thing that's stood out to me about the Odyssey versus the Iliad, especially off the back of having, I guess, read it over the course of the last month and a half, is something I guess I've observed or tried to point out is that in the Iliad, things seem extremely, or things are presented in a very value-free way, in a sense that, like we're not told how to feel about Achilles. We're not told how to feel about most characters. There's some that are given like a darker brush than others, but for the most part, like there's a reason why we can go so back and forth on like how we perceive all these characters and these actions, and we're left to sort of wonder what is right, what is just, how do we process these things, at least in our modern times. But in the Odyssey, there is significantly less ambiguity. We are, I think, presented pretty unambiguously these suitors as there's variety between them, but they are largely unambiguously like in the wrong. They're bad.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They're doing wrong. And Telemachus, as you pointed out, Llama, is like this is the correct thing to do. He's been gracious, and Athena is very gracious as well as in her guise as mentees, and yeah. So shifting gears from like from the Iliad, like, okay, how do I interpret this exactly? Like I still have to wear that hat here, but it's different, and I'm curious as to how that hat will choose to fit over the course of the read.
The way that you say values free is not exactly how I think of it, but what it is to me is that in the Iliad, you're kind of expected to know what these values are that are being implied.
When I say value, I mean like moral value or moral weight. Like if I say like you're a coward, that's different from me saying, oh, you ran away, because coward has a value to it as opposed to running away, which is more neutral. It's like, okay, this can mean multiple things.
Sure, but I think there are implications in the Iliad that you're supposed to take away from those phrases, is what I'm saying. I think we're in complete agreement. I'm just kind of trying to word it a different way for my own mental, puzzle pieces fitting together. So, whereas in the Iliad, there are values that are kind of hinted towards or perhaps left up to the reader's discretion, in the Odyssey, it is completely explicit what these values are, what you are to do with them, and the ways in which they are being subverted.
So that being said, here in book one, absolutely, the suitors are pretty unambiguously bad. Lots of different sources tell us, as the audience, this is how we're supposed to think of them, right? We have Telemachus, who's saying they've gobbled up my entire inheritance. We have Athena in the guise of Mentees saying, this is a really bad situation. Like, this shouldn't stand. But keeping a long eye towards the end of the book, things are not necessarily all as they seem. So think, for example, what happens towards the very end when, spoiler alert, sorry, all the suitors get killed by Odysseus and Telemachus, right? In this sort of massive archery bloodfest. The way that the Odyssey ends in book 24, with the families of the suitors and everybody getting into this big tussle, really makes you wonder about this sort of unambiguous picture that we're getting of these guys here in book one. Are we supposed to look back from book 24 back to the very beginning here and say, oh, these guys got what they deserved? Or is it sort of setting up, is book 24 problematizing that sort of monolithic view that we have of them right now. I completely agree that
Yeah.
is very unambiguous here, but I'm interested to see how these feelings and thoughts might change throughout the course of the next 12 episodes or so.
I actually agree with you completely. And I think when I'm discussing like the non-ambiguity of, I think I'm talking more in the poet is telling you specifically what the values are in this
Absolutely.
society. So it's less that I necessarily think that they're forming an unambiguous judgment that the suitors are
Right.
bad, more just that they are setting the stage for a set of values that will remain consistent throughout the
Absolutely.
Odyssey.
100%.
So, like, whether the status of, like, are the suitors all bad or all good, or do the suitors' families have a legitimate gripe at the end, which I think to a certain extent
Right.
they do. And that's for reasons we'll get into much,
Right.
much later. But what I mean by the non-ambiguity is more just in the sense of, like, in the Iliad, a lot of things are left up to, like, oh, I wonder what the values of that
Absolutely.
time were. And in this example, there is very little question
Absolutely.
about that because of the emphasis on, this is what a guest should do. This is what a guest shouldn't do. They tell you this over
Absolutely.
and over. So I think that just gives it, I think that's almost kind of why it can seem easier to read at times, because the book is telling you what you need to know. Whereas the Iliad for me just opens up so many questions.
And if we want to sort of try to wheel our gaze in a different direction, and I don't know like what exactly the political makeup is of Ithaca, but we have to remember that Odysseus isn't just like some rich guy. He's the
Right.
king.
Right.
And his absence, I suspect, leaves a vacuum of, if not power,
Absolutely.
then like some ruling or guiding force, some definitive, set ruler or what have you. And Telemachus, as he is now, is not that guy. He's immature. He lacks confidence. He cries openly due to frustration and stuff like that. Which, I mean, I don't want to shame him for expressing his emotions, but at the same time,
he's just a
there's
sensitive
times to
young
cry
man.
and there's times not to.
Yeah.
He is. He's no Odysseus, and even if he is not, he's certainly no king. So the desperation, or if you want to read it as desperation, the desperation of the suitors or the interest of the suitors can certainly be framed as, or could be framed, I guess, as a crisis of politics, of just their everyday livelihood. However we want to view their everyday livelihood, I don't know how well off they are or what the state is of Ithaca due to Odysseus' absence. But, he's been gone for 20 years, right?
Right.
This is going to be I'm going to be so thrown off this entire time. So just for reference, I went to Ithaca College. I lived in Ithaca, New York for like 4 and change years. So I'm going to be thrown off frequently throughout this when we're talking about Ithaca. And I'm like, oh, I used to. Okay. That aside, actually what you said, Wriste, just now also brings up another thing for me, which is this is also somewhat of a coming of age story.
Yeah.
Very much so for Telemachus, because a lot of what you just talked about, his youth, his immaturity, his kind of sensitivity, changes a lot throughout the course of the Odyssey.
For sure. And I think we even get some flashes of that in how far he really needs to go in terms of maturing and learning what he needs to do, even here in book 1, in terms of not only his characterization, but also the things that he does and the way that he comports himself around other people. I'm thinking in particular about this episode with Phemius, the bard, where Phemius has come and he's singing a song about this guy who didn't come home from the war and everybody at home is really sad. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, hears it and she comes down from her chamber in tears, basically asking Phemius, please stop singing the song. It makes me really, really sad whenever I hear you sing it. Telemachus just comes out of nowhere. I mean, he basically says, Mom, just let him do what he needs to do. He's a bard. He's going to sing the song. You go ahead and go back to your loom and your weaving, and let the slave women do what they're supposed to do too. It's for, and here quoting Emily Wilson's translation at line 358 or so. It is for men to talk, especially me. I am the master. Really, Telemachus? Are you? It sort of doesn't feel that way at this point. Methinks the young child doth protest too much. Yeah. And
I'm getting little echoes of Agamemnon in Telemachus.
Real.
I mean, as I've said before, I read a lot of insecurity in Agamemnon and how he comports himself in the Iliad. A little more, kingly than Telemachus, but Telemachus is obviously being much more forthcoming about it here, where he's like, sort of insisting that he's the man of the house.
Right.
It is harder to take him seriously,
especially given everything else that's happening. Yeah, for sure.
And certainly the suitors don't take him seriously at all. Telemachus goes up to them and says, "You got to stop this. Stop eating all my food. Go eat elsewhere. Stop trying to take one man's wealth. I'll call upon the gods. Zeus will grant vengeance. You will be punished and destroyed right here." And even though basically all of what he says is true, they don't take him seriously at all. I mean, Antinous pretty much laughs in his face, and Eurymachus doesn't have much more regard for him either.
Eurymachus is a little milder about it.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is all talk, but he's a little more, I guess, hospitable toward his host than Antinous. At least through lip service, he says, "Telemachus, the gods must choose which of us will be king of Ithaca. So I hope you keep your possessions and rule your house. No man drive you out," which is like a decent compromise considering his position. He doesn't. He's not wishing ruin upon him, but at the same time, this is
right. But I would still like to bang and marry your mom.
But
doesn't everyone? I guess.
But especially when we compare Eurymachus against Antinous, who is just an awful guy, just an awful person in every
he's just straight up an asshole
interaction. Yeah, exactly.
Antinous is awful, and in making this like the little rubric that I made for setup, I just put in to the next chapter, like, Antinous is a dick. Antinous continues to be a dick. Like, this guy is so unlikable, and as are many of the suitors, but I think it's interesting that they kind of set up Eurymachus as almost like a foil to him,
right,
as a softening element.
And what's really interesting too, so apologies again for the language nerdery here, but Antinous and Eurymachus actually, the etymologies of their names sort of lend some power to these characterizations. Antinous comes from the preposition anti, which is basically what it means, like in English. Like, if you're anti something, you're against something, or it's often like in place of something.
Hostile.
Exactly. And the nous part basically has to do with thought or reason. So basically, he's anti-thought, he's anti-reason, he's doing stuff that's really not advisable, i.e., being a real dick to Telemachus and to everyone around him. Eurymachus, really interesting name too, literally broad fighter, like he fights everywhere. And also, for that matter, Telemachus, far fighter, as in fighter at a distance. So it's really interesting how these names sort of like play into the characterizations that we're seeing here all the way at the beginning of book one.
Yeah, I mean, I just know reading it, I was like, Antinous, like, I think antagonist.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is similar etymological roots there with the anti at the beginning, for sure.
Also, these books are like way shorter than the Iliad, so the pacing is also going to throw me off a little bit. But I like that even though we don't have Odysseus for a while, we are given a taste of Odysseus through Athena, where Telemachus asks her who he is,
right,
as mentees, and she says, and she goes into this long, I don't know how true it is, like, to the real man mentees, but we know that this is a lie. She is, to use, I guess, a more value-free or a fabrication.
She is spinning a yarn.
Yeah.
Yes, and this happens a lot. Odysseus will very often respond to, like, pretty straightforward questions about who he is with these long, elaborate stories about who he isn't. And
yeah, like none of which are true in the least.
Right.
I'll actually be curious to when I read this, and again, getting ahead of ourselves, but when I read this over for the first time a couple months ago, I was actually curious as to, like, because when you lie, you're not bringing it out of nothing necessarily. You are drawing on your own experience. You are even if what you're saying is completely false, it may still have some foundation,
some kernel
of truth. It
may still
have some relevant truth to the person who's speaking it, even if like the actual, like, words are false. And so I'll be curious to dig deeper into the tales that Odysseus says, and if we should just, like, hand wave them off as this is another Odyssean lie, or is he inadvertently revealing something about himself? There are some parts that where, at least in his stories, he definitely reveals some things about himself that he probably shouldn't have, and I'll be interested to get to those.
I think it's also interesting to think of them as, like, so, like, there are many different types of lies in life. There are lies of necessity, there are lies of amusement, there are lies of omission. There are lies that are, mostly a truth with a sprinkle of lie, and there are lies that are just complete bald-faced lies. And there is variance within the Odyssey in the types of lies that these people tell, and how kind of easily deciphered they are. Sometimes it's like, you're lying to me, or I see right through you, and then sometimes it's like, oh, this guy is telling me a story, and it's a fantastic story, and I believe every word of it. And so, like, with the, these stories that Odysseus tells, I think there's also often going to be times where, like, there's a point to why he is saying what he's saying, and why he is concocting this story. So it'll be interesting to get into that later. But I think we should probably get towards the end of book 1. I mean, so what we're talking about now is we have, Athena and Telemachus. Athena in the guise of Mentes, and Telemachus over here kind of crafting their plan to get Telemachus to Pylos.
Yep. Send them off to visit Menelaus and Nestor in Sparta and Pylos.
Yep.
Two characters which we are now very familiar with, and I'm excited to see because I love that
Hunting
part.
for word about Odysseus.
Yep.
Is his
and
father
then we
still
have
alive?
The suitors continuing to antagonize Telemachus and kind of press upon the reasons why he needs to do this. We have the prophecy from the bard, essentially, and where we kind of leave off, and this is fascinating to me. So towards the end of book 1, as Eurymachus is kind of what we were talking about before, Eurymachus is kind of softening what Antinomus is saying, and asking if, like, who is this stranger that has just come? Because they don't know that this is Athena. They just see some dude who came, and Telemachus did the right thing and brought them into the home. And what Telemachus says back to Eurymachus when he asks who the stranger is and if he has news of Odysseus fascinates me, because, and this is one of many times this will be said, he says, Eurymachus, my father is not ever coming home. I don't listen now to any gossip. And he's lost all hope already. And we're at the very beginning of the Odyssey.
Well, I don't know if we're supposed to read this necessarily as, like, a loss of hope, because this last line that Telemachus says is packaged as a lie. He knows
it is also tempered.
Well,
it is tempered by.
Yeah, so when he says, like, when he actually answers Eurymachus's question, who is this person? He knew in his heart that she was a god, due to the, I don't know, like the speed at which she left, or the power he felt in his heart. So he's already telling kind of a lie, and he's also priming himself and scheming to go hunt for his father. So when he says, Eurymachus, my father is not ever coming home, this is, we know that his determination to find his father is also in his heart. So what he says, obviously he's, or at least it's obvious to me on my reading that that this is not what he actually feels. He is saying this as a way of placating the suitors and making them think that, oh, I'm just, I'm I'm floppy. I'm
Yeah.
Yeah, like Rist, I read this as Telemachus sort of covering his tracks because he knows what he's about to do, which is to head off to Menelaus and Nestor and try to find word about his dad. If the suitors knew that Telemachus was being visited by Athena, if the suitors knew that he was going to go out and get some leads on Odysseus, they would probably have have a vested interest in preventing him from doing so. So I think he's trying to throw them off the scent by sort of dissembling here. He said, the boy said soberly, Eurymachus, my father's not ever coming home. I think the sober part there is just basically meant to try to convince them that he's not going to do anything crazy, that he's not going to try to make the homecoming of Odysseus a thing, which it very much will end up being.
Or, and I don't know how this is rendered from the Greek, but like his mind is sharp in this moment. When I think of sobriety, obviously, as sort of, for us, it means like not inebriated, but it can also have like a more positive connotation, I guess, which is like he is present and thoughtful. Again, I don't know how the original Greek is. Which I can see or look up right now.
There you go. you knew based on the way I was looking at my screen that I went to the Greek. The term that's used here is participle pepnumenos, which comes from a verb pepneumai, which means to be conscious, to be in full possession of one's faculties. But at a very core etymological meaning, it actually means to breathe, like to take a deep breath and to go for it. So basically, I think an even breath just means that you're fully in control. You know what's happening. So I think that's the import of
a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B.
Yeah, right.
He's both in control and he's he's putting out a mood.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's interesting. Like, I absolutely agree with you guys in the sense that, we know this is tempered by him knowing that this is Athena. But I will say this is a mood that prevails throughout other characters throughout the Odyssey. And that's why it's fascinating to me, because it starts off with Telemachus saying, my father is dead. And that he knows that that's maybe not the case. But throughout the Odyssey, people are like, everyone is convinced Odysseus is dead and has been for quite some time and are just like going through the motions.
Yeah, but to lend some weight to what you originally said about this Llama too, that he seems a little bit defeated in this moment as well. I mean, to be fair, but before Athena showed up as Mentes, or actually when Telemachus was talking to Athena in the guise of Mentes, he basically says something to the effect of like, I don't even know if I'm this Odysseus guy's son because he's been away for so long. Maybe he's dead somewhere.
That threw me off.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the nihilism that Telemachus exhibits throughout Book One, I think absolutely you're right that this does show up. Like,
I think he now has this glimmer of hope, but I think there is still part of him that's like, this Athena is pulling my leg. Yeah. Like, there's no way that my dad can possibly be alive, but now he has that hope. And he knows that if there's any chance of him finding out, that he has to go under the radar. So speaking to what you both were saying, like, he has to put on this front and he has to say this soberly so that he'll be believed by the suitors, so that they don't kill him before he can find out if there's any hope that his dad is alive. But I don't think at this point he genuinely believes that his father is alive.
Absolutely.
And on that note, however, we're basically at the end of Book One. And so I think now is a fantastic time to take a little break, refresh our teas, refresh our waters.
Woo.
And when we come back, we will continue on with Book 2 of the Odyssey. Hello, dear listener, and thanks for sticking with us through our little break. We'll be back in just a couple minutes, but I'd like to take a moment during the break to thank a few people and give a little information about the podcast. First, thank you for listening. This podcast has no sponsor. We've produced everything in-house and on our own time. And if you all are enjoying the fruits of our labor, that is the best thanks that we can imagine. You can follow us on Twitter at Homer_bound for new episodes, or just watch our podcast page wherever you're listening to us now. I'd like to thank Wriste for inviting me along on this adventure, which has been such great fun. I'd also like to thank the composer and performer of all the music you've heard throughout the episode, who happens to be my dad. Thanks, Dad. You're the absolute best. I'd also like to thank Bubbo for her contributions to the audio, Webs2D for original art of my llama character, Total Love for additional art and graphic design, and Ghosty for graphic design as well. I'd like to thank our many guests for their time and expertise, and finally, an especially big thank you to Dr. Daniel, who closes out each show with additional insights on our discussions. We hope you'll consider reading along with us. We're using the Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey, and while we try to keep things intelligible for those who are new to the story, you might get more out of our discussions if you've read ahead, so feel free to pause and return later after you've read up. We would also like to remind you to stay tuned after Wriste and I have finished, since Dr. Daniel will have some awesome words of wisdom to add to our discussion. All right, thanks for hanging out through our break, and I will give it back to me and Wriste for the second half of this episode of Homer Bound. And we have returned. Welcome back to Homer Bound. I have refreshed my tea as per tradition. I'm still drinking tropical tea. It's delicious. It's extremely hot. Wriste, I'm hoping, and Dr. Dan as well, I'm hoping that you guys have refreshed yourselves and are ready to get into book 2.
Yes, I've refilled my legs and stretched my water. I am ready to go.
Ready and raring.
Excellent. Because book 2... it's getting exciting already. It's called A Dangerous Journey.
Dun, dun, dun.
Most dangerous game is
Right?
Telemachus trying to leave his house.
It is a dangerous game trying to leave your house in this book. In this poem, this great story overall. It's, you know, as we've talked about just before, there's a lot of guest right home themes to this, and that kind of means that there's a lot of danger whenever you're going out from or coming back to your home, you know, as we'll see very late. When Odysseus comes home, it's not like, woo, party, Odysseus is back, you know, gotta kill a whole bunch of people first.
If we want to just, I guess, lay a quick foundation off of that note, on the subject of home anyway, Telemachus, I don't think he has a home right now. If we want to think of, like when we think of home, we think of it as a place of safety and comfort, and his
home is
home
not
is
his
clearly
own.
not, this may be a reach of a read, but when we were talking about how you know, he has it in his head from Athena that he has to go out and visit these men, Menelaus and Nestor. I could actually imagine him being like kind of glad to get out of the space and to search, if we want to.
Yeah, well, I mean, just think about how uncomfortable it must be. Like, imagine now in modern times, you have a bunch of people just come into your house, start eating from your fridge, you know, wiping their faces all over all of your blankets and stuff, and saying, like, your parents' stuff is not yours. It's ours right now until we find out that your dad is dead for sure, and then we're gonna choose which one gets to marry your mom. Like, I wouldn't feel comfortable in my house if a bunch of people just came in and started eating my food and making themselves at home without me inviting them in, or even necessarily with me inviting them in. So yeah, Telemachus is in an awkward spot, and I think the idea of him going to see Nestor and Menelaus must actually probably be very comforting to him. These men that his father knows so well, who he knows are safe people for him to go get advice from them. And I mean, we've all talked about how much we love Nestor. I love Nestor. I'm excited. So where we start though is Telemachus gets up in the morning, puts his fancy little shoesies on, oils his feet. Well, okay, I have a question. What is with the oiled feet?
Great question. Um, olive oil was a very ubiquitous substance in the ancient world, often being used in lots of different contexts to help soften skin, like as a moisturizer, essentially. Also used as soap in bathing. You would basically oil yourself up and then scrape off the oil in certain bathing situations and whatnot. It was just a very ubiquitous substance in the ancient world, used in lots of different contexts that we wouldn't necessarily use it today. So well-oiled feet, I think, similarly to like a well-moisturized face, I think is the implication here.
Okay, cool. So like basically this is saying Telemachus is, for all intents and purposes, well cared
Yeah, exactly.
for.
Yeah.
And despite despite his position of kind of discomfort right now with all these guys in his house, he's still taking care of himself. And at the end of this, it says he leaves the room looking just like a
right.
god.
And if we think about the purpose of this, he's calling basically a town meeting, and he wants to put the best image forward of himself. So I think the oiling, the clothing, and also the heavenly grace from Athena that he's going to get poured on him a few lines later, I think all contribute to that picture that he's trying to put out there of, I am the son of Odysseus, this is my household, all these guys are messing with it.
Yeah, and so exactly as you says, he calls this council with all of the Greeks, and it seems, the suitors are also in attendance. Basically everyone kind of gathers round and comes to listen to Telemachus say, I can't fight these guys. I can't really do anything here. But if I did, I would deal out a whooping.
Right. Yeah, around line 59, I cannot fight against them. I would be useless. I have had no training. But if I had the power, I would do it. Very very teenagerly.
Yeah, but it's like, it's so interesting to see him be like, it's not fair. And then, so right after this is what Wriste was talking about in the last book, where like he throws the scepter down and just bursts out crying.
Yeah, when we were comparing, not a few episodes ago, the Lattimore versus the Fagles translation, one thing that I remember being pointed out was like the use of exclamation points. I don't know how the punctuation works in the Greek, but they are abundant in this this sort of, I guess, rant by Telemachus. If I had the power, I would do it. It is unbearable what they have done. They've ruined my whole house. Well, exclamation point. It's not fair. Exclamation point. You suitors all should feel ashamed.
Yeah, every single one of these sentences that Wriste is reading right now is followed by an exclamation point.
And I guess I'm not totally sure how. So when this scene starts, when Telemachus brings these people together, there appears to be this like one elder who asks, "What's the news? Like, is what terrible, great, important thing has happened?" And Telemachus says, "There's no army coming to invade us or anything. I'm just beset and frustrated."
Yeah,
and we're given this this image of him looking like a god, and Athena has given him heavenly grace, whatever that means, perhaps enhanced his looks or what have you. But I don't think he wears it too well here. He is.
Yeah.
No, he has a hissy fit.
Yes.
He throws a royal little hissy fit and, throws down the scepter and starts crying. I mean, this kid has like a nervous breakdown, basically.
Sure. And to the question that you just posed about punctuation and exclamation points. So, ancient Greek doesn't have quite the same set of punctuation that modern languages do. And in fact, the way that these texts came down to us, there was often no spaces between words or things like that too. So like a lot of these editorial conventions and translation conventions are basically interpretations made by the translator or by the editor. in Greek, there are certain little words that can clue you into the flavor of a sentence. They're called particles that clue you into like, well, this sentence explains the previous sentence. This sentence is meant to be said with like sort of like a sort of like intonation or things like that. And I'm not seeing too much of that in Telemachus' speech here. The grammatical constructions are pretty straightforward. I'm not seeing any of these really powerful emotional particles or anything like that. And in the wrap up afterward, the closing to the speech, the Greek says, "Hos fatoko menos potidescape thron balegae dakru anapresas." He spoke in anger, koomenos, in sort of like this sort of like bileful, wrathful anger. He tosses the scepter to the ground, and he bursts out crying. Quite literally, is what it says here. So I think that the exclamation points are very rhetorically powerful here in the translation. And again, I think it's Emily Wilson's interpretation of what's happening here. I think that an exclamation point helps to set up this bursting forth of emotion in the tears and the throwing down the scepter better than if he were just simply delivering it without that sort of like raised intonation.
And then, so what happens after this is Telemachus has his little hissy fit. He hurls the scepter. He starts crying. Nobody says anything. And then we get to the part in the rubric, which I labeled Antinous is a dick. Because he really is. He starts tearing into Telemachus and tells a little background on what has happened in the intervening years between when the Trojan War ends and Odysseus is on this journey to find his way home. And so this is a story that I knew of before I read the Odyssey, I'm pretty sure, even when I was like a teen. The story of Penelope weaving on her loom, weaving what I assume is like a tapestry or something on her loom.
For Laertes.
A shroud, okay. And the suitor, she tells the suitors, when I finish this, then I will choose one of you to marry. And she works on this for 3 years. And each night she goes back and picks out what she has done so that she's never actually making any progress on it. She's just throwing them off the scent. And then finally they discover what she's been doing and they get extremely angry and they force her to finish it.
Can I just say that this is, I think I mentioned before, like I like writing, I like storytelling, it's fun. And this is a very, I think there's a lot of this in the Odyssey. I imagine there's some fainter versions of this in the Iliad, but stuff like this is very peculiar from a so like if you can imagine like the logistics of weaving something and then unweaving it later and doing this for years on end, like the way the suitors learned of this is because someone told them. But I imagine, I mean, I don't suspect these suitors are stupid. Like they like from a logistical standpoint, you would see that, okay, no progress is being made. Clearly something's up. And I'm not saying this as like a mark against this kind of story, because I really like the sort of simplicity of it. It's not too worried about, oh, but what if they, like, why didn't they notice? Like this is something that someone would make in a YouTube video as like, this is a plot hole thing. But there's a lot of stuff like when Odysseus gives his name as nobody to Polyphemus, the Cyclops. You could, like, we also probably know that the Cyclops is like relatively intelligent. He would know that he's being duped, and he would then clarify to his other Cyclops friends that it wasn't actually nobody who stabbed him. It was a guy who called himself nobody, and that would clear up the confusion.
Although, I don't know, I'd like to kind of offer up a counterpoint to that, which is, I think the men of this story would have just been like, oh, weaving is a woman's thing. Why would we pay attention to that? And I honestly don't see them as particularly
at least when it comes to the logistics of weaving a shroud, because as
right, like, what would they know about that?
As Llama says,
taken in isolation. Well, I would say taken in isolation, this sort of thing, I would agree. Taken sort of whole cloth.
Wow.
There's a
nicely
there are
done.
A lot of things like this where the trickery is sort of massaged into the story by a suggestion of something which is clever. as opposed to carefully working out all of the logistics and then delivering like all these explanations that would prevent it from some kind of, logistical attack. I mean, like, I'm not familiar with weaving, but I imagine that if someone said, hey, I have to finish this thing, I could then conceptualize, oh, if you're working on it, then it should make progress. Or I would be able to like see the work and notice that there's progress one day and then it's undone the next day. And again, this isn't a point against it. I like this sort of thing. It is a from modern perspective, like very weird, because when we think of like, okay, I have to think of a solution to this problem that our hero is facing, you have to work out all of these logistics and cover all your cover your ass for all of these things. But this isn't so worried about that as much as the point isn't like this is the most logistically airtight thing ever. The point of this is like Penelope is clever, and we don't. And we don't have to dig into the real logistics of it. We just know that she is clever and that this is something that worked regardless of the logistics.
And to take that point a little bit further too, to give a little bit of like background to why this part of the story is here now, I believe, I think works on two fronts. One is sort of to what Llama was talking about earlier about weaving being a woman's work. In the ancient world, weaving and working with thread and things like that were seen as basically metonymy for womanhood. If you were a good wife, if you were a good woman, you were supposed to be working at the loom and making things and working with your hands in that way. Later on in Greek and Roman culture, particularly in Roman culture, weaving and working at the loom were often bywords for good management of a household and for a wife being faithful to her husband. So I think the introduction of the weaving motif here is meant to support Penelope's characterization on that regard of being faithful to Odysseus at no matter what the cost ends up being. The second thing goes to what you just said, Wriste, about Penelope being clever and her ability to come up with this plan that the suitors, for one reason or another, whatever reason it ends up being, don't catch on to for 3 years until somebody clues them in the fourth year. This aligns Penelope with Odysseus as the two cleverest people in the story. And one of the major ideas that ties the two of these lovebirds together, I guess, is this Greek term called homophrosyne. It's a word I think that appears only like once in the Odyssey, but it's used in the context of the relationship between Odysseus and Penelope, and it basically means like-mindedness. They share a mind. They think the same way. They interact with other people and the world in the same way. So I think the fact that we're introducing Penelope's cleverness here, her ability to pull the wool over the eyes of the suitors, I think that is meant to align her with Odysseus and make it clear that these two are the ones who belong together, as opposed to any of the suitors that are trying to make that claim.
And I think it's interesting that Odysseus, or like the sorts of things we associate with Odysseus, are exemplified by two female characters first. Like we have Athena and her elaborate lie, and now we have Penelope with her cleverness
Absolutely.
At the loom.
It's the wise guy family.
It's true.
And they're like patron god of the wise guy family. And this is also something that is attributed to Telemachus too. It's kind of frequently acknowledged that he's somewhat of a work in progress because he's a little baby.
A little baby.
But it is attributed to him. They're frequently calling him cunning like his father, or
Can I bring up? I was actually going to save this for when I think it's actually brought up, but since you brought it up, that sort of thing stood out to me, like cunning like his father. It's weird because Odysseus left him as a child, but we know that Penelope is just as cunning as he is. So he is cunning like his mother.
And
absolutely, and they're not going to say that, but absolutely, it almost feels like it's kind of like a familially inherited trait of sorts, and something that has kind of been imbued upon this family by greater destiny of like, these are the smart people, these are the family of wise guys. I'm going with that, at least for now. Well, it's a work in progress. But yeah, I think that's a really good point to bring up. Like, there is this familial trait that these are crafty, cunning people, and they use it greatly to their advantage throughout the entire story.
I'm thinking about it, I guess it kind of depends on, I don't know how they viewed, like, I guess the passing down of traits, I guess. So, like, for me, I would imagine that if someone possesses a trait, perhaps some of it is due to your family lineage, but there's also, nature and nurture, right? Which is why I say, Telemachus is clever like Penelope as opposed to his father, because his father wasn't there to exemplify this cleverness for him. Any cleverness that Telemachus has picked up or learned is given to him either by his mother or perhaps is exemplified conversely with Athena as his father figure. So he's constantly taking on these
Daddy Athena.
These male forms to guide him in one way or another.
That's a really interesting question about how these traits are inherited or passed down and whatnot. I mean, in terms of what it actually looked like on the ground in terms of Greek culture and Greek families, I'm not entirely sure. But thinking through mythology and other famous families throughout Greek mythology and lit, another family that comes to mind is the House of Atreus, basically the household that Agamemnon and Menelaus belonged to. And Agamemnon and Menelaus' ancestors, like Thyestes and Atreus, were not good people. In fact, the house is characterized by this sort of wickedness that gets passed down from generation to generation, doing really awful, terrible things until the cycle finally gets broken by Orestes, the son of Agamemnon. So I think that there is something to be said for like inherent or like passed down traits from generation to generation. Whether it comes from the matrilineal side or the patrilineal side, who knows? I'm not entirely sure. But I think for sure there's something to be said for the wise guy family having that sort of in the water, as it were.
It's gonna be a thing. I'm making it a thing.
It'll be on the t-shirts.
No. Please don't immortalize my stupid moniker for this family that way. In any case, so Antinous is a dick.
Oh, yes.
We've established that, and
we do get a prophecy.
We do get a prophecy. This is what I was about to move on to. Thank you for the help. So this is another one of those bird signs. We've had several of these in the Iliad. For whatever reason, the ancient Greeks apparently really love bird signs.
Oh yes.
I'm into it because the imagery is super awesome. So 2 eagles come down from a mountain peak and basically like attack all of these suitors. Am I correct in interpreting that?
Yep.
And just rip into them with their talons, which is metal. And oh man, I hate this name. Halitherses?
There you go, Halitherses, yep.
Holy shit. I can't believe I just pronounced that correctly.
Gold star.
So this older leader, Halitherses, speaks up because he knows birds and bird law, apparently. For any of you who just caught that Always Sunny reference, I appreciate you. And he foresees doom for these suitors. He sees this as a direct sign, which it absolutely is. As we've just been told, Zeus just sent these eagles down to have at the suitors. And he's like, you're all gonna die.
This happened once in the Iliad as well, and yeah, we've talked about the inextricability of the gods in the world, and how like the existence of and the power of the gods is not like even a question in the way that we would consider it to be very much in question in like modern times. The prospect of atheism, I don't suspect, was terribly fruitful, at least in the Homeric world. But we have this interesting middle ground where there's room for, I guess, doubt with these sort of ambiguous signs. Like when a god comes down to say one thing or another, like as themselves, they're usually listened to. Although notably, Zeus, pointed out, there's this one guy who didn't listen to us, and look what he got. And so we're kind of getting, if we want, an echo of that here, where Zeus is very clearly sending down this, like we as readers know this, of course. In the Iliad, Hector spurned Polydamas's reading of a bird sign that they should retreat, and here this feels so easy to read, like anyone could read it, like these 2 eagles attacking the suitors. It's like this is a pretty and eagles are the birds of Zeus, or Zeus's favorite bird. Like, I don't think I need to be the son of Mastor to to know
Right.
what's going on here. But as we'll see, as we see, like, basically after the prophecy, there is immediate doubt as to what's going on, and the motivation is like similar to Hector's in the Iliad. Hector wants to take Troy, and so or to take the ships.
Yeah, he doesn't want it to be true. None of the suitors want this to be true or believe it to be true, because they pretty much all believe that Odysseus is dead at this point, and that Penelope has just been biding her time. What I love what Eurymachus says, and this is word for word from the translation, probably somewhere around like 180 or shortly thereafter. Many birds go flying in sunlight, and not all are meaningful. That little one-off just cracks me up, but it's kind of really such a symbol of that really willful ignorance. Like, it's just
exactly,
slightly silly thing to say. Not all birds are meaningful. And it's like these two very specific birds have just come out of fucking nowhere to swoop down on you and make your life a living hell. And then he says, Odysseus is dead, away from home, and I wish that you had died with him to stop your forecasts.
Yep.
So this is once more like people who attack prophets. We saw this in the Iliad. Like, people who naysay and are violent towards prophets, whether with words or actual physical actions, like, things do not tend to go well for them.
Nope. And it's also interesting too, because not only do we get Halitherses, son of Mastor, making this prophecy about what everyone can see, these eagles attacking the faces of the suitors, like, that's a pretty clear sign too. But we also get a little nugget about what happened before the Trojan War began as well. Halitherses says around line 172 or so about a prophecy that he made to Odysseus as well, about his pathway home. I told him when he left for Troy with all the Argives, he would suffer most terribly, and all his men would die, but in the 20th year he would come home unrecognized, and now it's coming true. So, like, that also sets us up for what we can expect in the later books. Odysseus is coming home. This is the point at which the story is really going to sort of boil over, despite the willful ignorance of people like Eurymachus and the suitors trying to put their fingers in their ears and go, la, 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 I can't hear you. I can't hear what you're trying to say.
I think Eurymachus's little speech here is interesting. He does maintain what I guess I have to read right now as, if not some kind of goodwill, then at least a well enough presented face of goodwill toward Telemachus. He couches this prophecy as distressing to Telemachus, as, like, if you like jump into his head and assume he's saying these things in good faith, I think that makes some sense. Like, why would, like, Odysseus has been gone for 20 years. That's a long time, and the war's been over like 10 years ago. Like, if he's not here now, what's taking him so long? And so that would be sort of distressing. And also, further on, this is right before line 200. What I find interesting is he says, "We will never cease from this torturous courtship." The word torturous is, I'm unsure of what the object of that descriptor is. Like, is it torturous for them? Does he know that it's torturous for Telemachus? Does he know it's torturous for Penelope? Is it torturous to Ithaca? What is holding this word up?
I feel like my response to that is one of my favorite responses to when a person answers, hypothetically a question with a bunch, like, my answer is yes, all of those things. Because I think it's torturous to everyone. It's just torturous. It's uncomfortable.
Well,
they know it.
I'm mainly thinking from the suitor's perspective. Like, it seems like they're having fun.
Yeah, but I think it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for them too. They're having the time of their lives, but they're all sitting there biding their time, waiting to know whether or not this guy is actually going to come back, even though they don't really think he is. But so it is torturous for them. They want to get their hands on the money.
Right.
They want the prize. They're sitting here, like, not taking wives and giving up these opportunities to increase their status, all hoping to be the one that takes home the biggest prize, which is a kingship, essentially.
For sure. Unfortunately, the Greek doesn't really help us out in this regard. Emily Wilson translates this pretty straightforwardly. What the Greek says here is basically, I think the sons of the Achaeans will not stop from this argaleis menestuos, which quite literally means like troublesome or painful courtship. So quite literally, that's what the Greek says, but it doesn't really point in one direction or another about who this is meant to describe, who its torture is for. So I think Llama's spot on here. A, B, C, all of the above. I think it's really annoying for everyone involved. The household, Penelope, Telemachus, but also the suitors who are biding their time and waiting to see which one of them is going to come out on top.
To lean further into the suitors, real quick before we move on from them, do they have to be there? Not so much have to as in like someone's forcing them to, but it's like when you're like, we've all been in positions in our lives where, you know, it would be so disadvantageous for us to not do something that for us to not do it is basically not an option. And so like societally, like even though like some of these guys are being dicks, like Antinous, I think some are being a little more at least with their words courteous or good-willed, perhaps. What's keeping them there?
And then, of course, there have to be the guys who are just kind of hanging around with it's like, oh, everyone else is here, so might as well give it a shot. Like, can't hurt.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure about how, not compulsory, that's not the right word, but I don't know how much anyone is necessarily being forced to be here as much as the ones who are here see an in. They see an opportunity because, 20 years away from the beginning of the Trojan War, Odysseus is still not home. We have a sitting duck of a kingship and a sitting duck of a household just waiting to be taken over. So it's the folks that are actually there that are going to get the first claim. So I think that by being there every day, by eating up the food, by wiping their mouths on the linens, I think that they're sort of like a dog staking out their territory, like peeing on a patch of grass trying to stake their territory.
I think my instinct now, and I wonder if this will change down the line as we get more into it, but this feels opportunistic to me.
Absolutely.
It doesn't feel like there is some social, impetus or necessity for them to be there in the way that I feel like you're describing, Wriste, but that like it's an opportunity. They see kind of a sitting duck in Telemachus, like this weak little boy that he can't be the king. One of us has to, do that.
Right.
But I also think that there probably is a degree of like pressure just to take power in this vacuum,
For
so
sure.
I don't know. I think it could potentially be a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, where like maybe there is some pressure to be there just in terms of circumstance. But is there an actual like, if you were all not lined up for this, people would view it as shameful? I don't think that is necessarily
I guess my mind keeps going to Diomedes and like the ridiculous things that he does that he's done to, or the ridiculous ways he's acted in some cases to preserve his badge of courage. And I think about like what kind of social pressures, which is not to excuse like dickish or otherwise terrible behavior, but what kinds of pressures would be influencing these suitors to show up? And like a kingship is like certainly a big one, but like, is there a similar kind of like I guess fear of, I don't know, shame or reputation hit, especially after having been there for so long? Like they're all sort of all in.
So,
it's like
so given what we've talked about in the Iliad and coming to this story in the Odyssey, I would say it's less fear or shame and more the pursuit of glory, as was before. Yeah. I think that this is not necessarily quite as highlighted in the Odyssey, but I think it's still very much a core value of Greek life. So it's a continuous theme, even though it's not as explicitly stated in this. I think this is just pursuit of glory. Who doesn't want to be the king? Here's a golden opportunity, a weak point, what better time? And plus he's off finding, his way back home, and there's a bunch of food here and fat pigs and stuff. that we can like live the good life while we're waiting for this to be decided. What's not to love about it?
I really love the way that you phrased that, the way that you said that, sort of this big theme that's in the Iliad that might be a little bit less prevalent here in the Odyssey, but it's still there. In the same way that, Xenia, guest friendship, wasn't really that much of a huge theme in the Iliad, but now it's a really huge one here in the Odyssey. So we see almost kind of like a little bit of a flip there too, right?
Yeah.
We still have the same core ideals, we still have the same core values. It's just a question of which ones we're hammering, which ones we're going to be highlighting, and which ones we can sort of like glean out of the situation rather than getting whacked over the head with it, I guess.
Yeah, we've left the war part of Achilles' shield, and we're in the like Greek life part of the the shield.
There you go.
Wanna...
Getting ready to do some grape stomping, some
there it is. Exactly.
Oil pressing. So where this gets us, this prophecy and this conflict between the suitors and Telemachus yet again, is it brings to a point where Telemachus kind of half-assed, I don't know, maybe not half-assedly, but like puts his foot down and says, okay, I'm off to Pylos. I'm off to Sparta. And, maybe gods will tell me what's going on. Maybe people there will tell me what's going on. I don't know. But if I come back and I haven't found out anything and I've found out that my father is dead, then one of you can marry my mom. And this seems to kind of sate them. And then we get Mentor. And this is actually Mentor. We will see Athena take the guise of Mentor. I think several times.
Yes.
Yep.
And it's interesting because Mentor also kind of serves up a warning message to these suitors. But he also says he doesn't blame their overconfidence. And he blames the people who are kind of standing by. And this is really interesting to me, because this will almost kind of play into what happens later when Odysseus comes back and gets revenge. On all of these suitors. He doesn't just get revenge on the suitors, he also gets revenge on the members of the household who kind of stood by and either actively let this happen or kind of passively let this happen.
Absolutely.
And this is the first, I think, seed for me that is planted about that portion of what is to come.
For sure. I mean, all it takes for evil to thrive is for good people to stand by and do nothing, right? And I think that that this is sort of the first, exactly to say, one of the first signs that this is what's going to happen. That also leads to other questions too, though. I mean, is Odysseus really justified in taking out his rage on these people in the way that he does when he comes back? That's a question for a later episode. But I think you're absolutely right that this is planting the seeds for saying, well, the suitors are doing something bad. Telemachus is up in arms, and Penelope is doing the best that she can too. What about everybody else? What about the people of Ithaca? What about the folks who think that Odysseus is still alive and want to preserve the household for him when he comes back? What are they supposed to be doing at this point?
Especially interesting that Mentor says, I do not blame the suitors' overconfidence, rough ways and violence eating up his household. They risk their lives, supposing that the master will never come back home. I'm not totally sure what to make of that. Like, does this mean that he recognizes that they are risking their lives, and so that risk is sort of justifies their actions? Or
honestly, what this says to me is like, these guys have balls. I think that's kind of what he's saying there, is like, I don't blame their overconfidence, because like, these guys have some cojones sitting in this guy's house, assuming that he's not going to come back and kill them all.
Yeah, for sure.
That's what I take from that.
They're putting themselves out there.
Yeah, like, I don't think it's a matter of casting blame actually in this instance. I think the phrase "I don't blame them" is more like, I don't fault or I understand what they're doing.
Right, yeah.
Because they're bold. They clearly don't give a fuck.
It seems like he's saying, like, it's anybody in the same position, it would be rational for them to act in this way because of the assumptions that they're making. Bold as hell, but I can understand where they're coming from, I think is what Mentor's trying to say here.
I guess as a warning for future episodes, this is this is how I've basically treated everyone in the Iliad, and I'll probably try to treat the suitors this way as well. I wanna dig into them and see like.
Oh, you are consistently playing the devil's advocate, and I actually really like it because there have been a number of instances where you've really kind of brought me around to certain people, not necessarily into liking them more, but just into thinking about them differently and understanding like what different motivations that they could have than the ones that some people may automatically kind of ascribe to them because of the way that these narratives are presented throughout both of the both of the epic poems.
Yeah.
So I kind of really appreciate it. And it's not necessarily maybe always devil's advocate.
I just want to try to engage with everything as critically as I can, and so I think it would be very easy for us to say like, Agamemnon's a dick, these suitors are all assholes, and then sort of engage with a story that way. I think that's like a failure of criticism or of critical reading. So I mean, this can apply to like literally anything, not just this. But if you want to engage with something in a as interesting a way as possible, I would say that you should try to put yourself in like the position of as many people as you can, and see if you can't figure out what they're coming from.
I think it's also just, and this is something I frequently try and do when I'm reading or watching something, is try and think of things as more morally gray as they seem, because it is often the case that, despite the way things are framed and the way things are made to seem and our initial instincts, there's always far more gray area in life than there seems to be. And it's important to take that into consideration. But also, these guys are dicks.
There are a lot of dicks.
It's also like, and this is something that I went on about a little bit a couple episodes again, about the idea of mutual exclusivity. Like, it's possible to be a dick and also live in a morally gray area. That's entirely possible.
And you can be a dick and also.
And it's also possible to
something meaningful to say, I guess. That's my position on Paris.
Yeah,
I think he's a huge dick, but I think some of the stuff he says is very rings super true.
He's like a little poncy princey boy, but that doesn't mean that he shouldn't have anything important to contribute, because even people like that have things to contribute, and to overlook that is to miss out. And I think that there is a degree to which everyone in this world has something important to offer, and even if they kind of suck. But let's sally forth. So this prophecy happens. The suitors kind of once again naysay it, and Telemachus is just like, whatever, and kind of goes on his way and begins to prepare with Athena to go on this journey. And the suitors kind of assent to Mentor and Halitherse is guiding his journey. So they're like, all right, we don't really care about these guys. You guys can go off and do your little thing. We're going back to Odysseus's house. It's party time. And then Athena comes to Telemachus in the guise of Mentor. So this Mentor has literally just talked very, very recently.
On the same page, he steals his identity.
literally on the same, yeah. Which is kind of like a sick irony, or I don't know, maybe not a sick irony, but it's just kind of silly.
I've said before that Athena really likes to play dress up, and that characterization
really
of her
does.
is like, I think, like super supported in the Odyssey, because she's always like changing forms and doing stuff as other people.
So I mean, that begs the question, why, right? Why here in the Odyssey does Athena dissemble herself so much, especially in these contexts where it seems kind of gratuitous? It's kind of silly. Like, Telemachus already knows that Athena's on his side. Like, why would she need to cover herself up, right? And I think that there's sort of two practical purposes to it. One is that if Telemachus needs an ally on the ground with him, he can't really have Athena in full divine glory standing next to him, right? I think that taking on the guys of Mentor, taking on the guys of Mentees is meant to sort of like help Telemachus get some plausible deniability in that regard. I think the other point of it too, though, is just sort of the larger question that's tied back to the conversation about lying as well, about dissembling, about what the purpose of it is, and when you need to do it and under what circumstances. This happens to Odysseus a lot. In terms of when he needs to disguise himself, most prominently when he returns home. He spends quite a long time after making it back to Ithaca in disguise, because he's still trying to formulate his plan about how to take his home back. So I think another point of connection between Athena and Odysseus in this regard happens in terms of disguises, and covering something up in order to affect a larger goal. And I think we're seeing that here in full force with Athena and Telemachus.
I guess this is like a more academic question. I don't know like what your familiarity is with like academic discussions about or around like the Odyssey. And y'all forgive me because this is an issue that I'm not like super literate in, but Athena spends a lot of her time as a man. Is there something there, I guess? Like what do we make of
Are there gender implications or
yes,
things in that regard?
Yes. To avoid making a fool of myself, I'll say that in that neighborhood.
Yeah, no, there's always an explanation, and I think there are two ways that I would answer it. One is that if you think about the disguises that she takes on in the context of these first two books of the Odyssey, they're people that are meant to be the interactions that she has with Telemachus in these disguises fit into roles that the Greeks would expect. So, for example, a guest friend. Normally, it's often men who travel from one household to another, rather than women traveling on their own or other issues like that. So the disguise of mentees, I think,
like the
convenience
of this would
exactly.
I'm thinking more in terms of like the qualia,
right?
Of that of being a female
right,
goddess,
exactly.
but taking the form and stature and position, for however long or short of again all these like male figures.
For sure, yeah. I mean, the second point that I was going to bring up too, and actually this sort of exposes one of my shortcomings as a classicist. I'm actually a little bit weak on mythology, surprisingly enough. But if I'm not mistaken, I think the birth of Athena was from the forehead of Zeus. And as opposed to the regular sort of like normal gestation from a woman's body and whatnot, right? So for that reason, Athena is not quite, I wouldn't go as far as to call her like a gender bender, to the extent that like a god like Dionysus is, or other deities in that regard. But Athena definitely has sort of a more
masculine energy.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Particularly, and we saw this a lot in the Iliad too. Maybe not quite as strongly, but for example, whenever she puts on like battle armor and starts going onto the battlefield and starts fighting, war is a very masculine trait in the ancient world, and Athena taking that onto herself, I think, also indicates a little bit of that masculine energy as well. So yeah, for sure. I don't know how much I would read into it with these two appearances in particular, but I think that there absolutely is something,
at least like wholesale, especially off the back of like Telemachus very sort of rudely asserting like what his mother's place is in the household, and yet I mean,
right.
I think this is
I also think there's something to be said for just gender roles and the fact that it may be that in a lot of these situations, a male voice will be more trusted, and she knows that. There are these she chooses trusted people, but also trusted male figures, because what Telemachus is lacking to a degree in his life is paternal figures and paternal energy. And so she's kind of bringing that into the situation. I'm not sure it's so much of a case of gender bending as much as that would be really interesting, but so much as the co-opting of a paternal figure so as to drive a message home easily.
That's exactly the point that I was going to bring up.
Make her work easier.
Absolutely, yeah. Because I mean, when you think about who Telemachus does have in his life, he has his mother. Penelope is right there. He has Eurycleia, this very trusted slave that has been around since Telemachus
Nanny.
was born. Exactly, Nanny
I love
Eurycleia,
Nanny.
who's going to show up a lot throughout the Odyssey. We love Eurycleia. She's wonderful.
Nanny is a badass.
Nanny's a badass. We love Nanny. But yeah, so I mean, he has these positive female figures in his life, and I think exactly as Llama said. The disguises that Athena takes on fill the void in Telemachus' life of positive masculine paternal like figures. I'd be interested to trace the other disguises that Athena takes on throughout the Odyssey. See if there's more of that.
I feel like
again, not gender bending, but
yeah,
but crossing
just
over.
yeah, and again, like to revisit what I just said, like off the back of like this sort of assertion of Telemachus of like the role of women in his life, like how is that, I guess, culturally read that Athena, this like she seems to be like unambiguously female even though she takes on like male forms.
Yeah.
Like how is that understood or read or reconciled? Like why wasn't Athena a man born out of Zeus's head? Why is she female? If this is something that seems well ingrained in the culture.
That's a really interesting question, and I think that it might deserve a podcast in its own right, because it
I was just thinking that.
Yeah,
it's like, whoa, that is.
It asks a lot of questions about like.
It's a great question, though.
It's an excellent question, and one that's pretty large because in terms of the way that the Greeks considered gender roles, like in terms of like sexuality, in terms of like gender in the household, like there are lots of expectations that the Greeks had, where the gods break a lot of these rules in terms of like the expectations. I mean, like in terms of again, my immediate example is Dionysus, who does all these sort of like feminine things and breaks the gender binary and other things like that. So I think that it's a very interesting question, and I think that Athena occupies a very interesting liminal role in the consciousness of the Greeks. I'm just not entirely sure exactly how to package that all into
yeah, I know,
it's
a question for our readers to dig into, perhaps, or for our readers, for our listeners
to ponder themselves. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, and I think Emily Wilson has also worked to highlight like the role of women in the Odyssey, both in her introduction, which I highly recommend everyone read. It's very good, and also in like her rendering of like these characters. And also, it's been a long time since I've read the Fagel's translation, which I think is what I read like when I was way younger. But maybe just I imagine it kind of bears itself out naturally just in the nature of the story. So, but enough of that. We've found our dead ends on this matter. I don't know, these are things that we can sort of put a pin in and I guess track as we go
absolutely
on.
Yeah, and this kind of brings us towards the end in the sense that we have this interaction with Athena as mentor. Telemachus continues to kind of tell the suitors like, all right, I'm going now on this little journey. Antinous continues to
be a dick. Yep,
be a dick.
Yeah. Oh no, he's going to kill us. I'm so afraid.
Yeah, they're kind of that they like spare no opportunity, and Antinous especially, to like roast Telemachus.
Yep.
It's kind of hilarious because Telemachus pretty much just kind of takes it all and is like, all right, you're all gonna die.
Oh yeah.
And then Telemachus, as we were just talking about Nanny, whom I love.
We love Nanny.
She receives Telemachus, and he asks her to get a bunch of wine and stores, and this is always, these are always the parts where I start getting hungry. So talking about like all of these amazing like wines and oats and barleys and things, and she like has this kind of hopeless reaction that I was talking about before, of why are you going to do this? He's gone, and he kind of gets to give her the first hint that all is not lost, and is able to tell her, don't tell my mom until she, I've been gone for a while, but like this is not the end. The gods have blessed this plan. I know this. So Nanny agrees to keep this secret from Penelope, and Athena, disguised as Telemachus, goes throughout town, and this is, yet another, but I think this serves a very real purpose, which is she is taking the form of the master of the house, as it were, at this time, and going and summoning up all the people who she knows will help him to go on to this journey. Wriste, you clearly want to say something about this.
This is another thing that we'll be tracking, or at least I'll be tracking as we go on. And we talked about the role of gods in the Iliad, and how like meaningful and like when Athena blows Hector's spear away from Achilles, or returns Achilles' spear to him after he throws it. Very. I wish I'd asked. Sorry, in the video game Hades, you can do literally the same thing with the weapon, the spear.
Achilles' spear.
And I wonder if
the Achilles aspect. I mean,
with
the other
it's
ones
true.
too,
It's kind of the
but
opposite of Achilles' aspect, because like when your main character Zagreus throws his spear, you can like recall it back to you, and that's just evocative of the image of like Athena returning Achilles' spear to him. But sorry, I'm getting a little bit off topic. We talked about the role of the gods in the Iliad, but in this one, the gods are like intensely. I mean, we've been talking about Athena, I think more than, or at least as much as Telemachus. Like talking about this coming of age story,
and
for
certainly more than Odysseus
for Telemachus. But Athena is really. I mean, there is. If we want to borrow the imagery of the crafts, Athena really is weaving all of these threads for Telemachus to grab hold of. She's taking his form and hiring a crew. She's giving him directions. Hey, go here, go there, and at the same time, she's going to be, or she has been, or will be, or is guiding Odysseus through his troublesome journey. And so the god presence is dialed up to 11 in the Odyssey.
Oh yeah, I think whereas, in the Iliad, there are times where you kind of question how much the gods really are doing, or like how direct their interference is. There's zero question of that in the Odyssey.
For sure.
There's so much explicitly like Athena did this. Boom. That's it. It happened. Whereas, like sometimes in the Iliad, things are a little more subtle. It's not that you're questioning whether the gods are doing it or not. It's just you're questioning like how directly they're interfering. Like instead of pinging an arrow, off to the side, she's like going around and summoning a crew for this journey.
And maybe this will help us more clearly, like having again this god presence dialed up to 11. Maybe this will help us more clearly see the real mortal choices that Zeus was talking about. Maybe
for sure.
We'll see, I guess. I'll be.
Well, I certainly think, for my part at least, it'll be a greater contrast. It helps you draw the line a little more clearly as to where the gods end and the mortals begin in terms of the choices that are made, because there's just so much more weight upon how much Athena and other gods are actually doing in the Odyssey, as opposed, at least in contrast to the Iliad.
Both when the gods are acting good or well, as here with Athena and Telemachus, and also when they act very badly. I mean, Poseidon in the mid books of the Odyssey is a huge dick. He does some terrible things to people who are just trying their best to help out a stranger. So I think tracing the involvement both in positive and negative ways, I think it will be very fruitful from this point on.
Yeah, and speaking of positive interference from the gods, we kind of close out book 2 with Athena quite literally calling a favorable wind for Telemachus' ship as he sails away for Pylos and Sparta to visit Nestor and Menelaus. And it ends, and part of what I love about this is you can kind of see why Athena favors this family. it ends with them pouring out drinks and toasting to Athena, because it like Telemachus knows who is buttering his bread right now.
For sure. Yeah, and I mean, it's a nice connection to what Telemachus and the crew are doing here, all the way back to the very first conversation between Athena and Zeus in book 1 as well. When Athena says, "Hey, don't you remember Odysseus, this guy who's been doing so much for us?" Zeus says, line, where are we? Around 65, line 65 of book 1, Zeus says about Odysseus, he's more sensible than other humans and makes more sacrifices to the gods. Again, it's really all about like what these folks are doing for the gods, and how they can repay them for kindness they've shown in the past.
If you could perhaps humor me one question before we close out. Since you mentioned names and their significance, like Antinous and Eurymachus,
Eurymachus,
Telemachus.
Eurymachus.
Yep.
You know, maybe this is just, you know, some kind of coincidence since I speak English and all that stuff, but I mean, mentees and mentor are very, they feel like they have very similar names and etymologies, if I may guess. And you know, obviously in English, a mentor is someone who dispenses wisdom, usually as like an older authority figure of some kind. Are we to take the significance of this name at its face value, or am I just sort of accidentally stumbling into it, like when I called out the name Chryses in book 1 of the Iliad?
That is a very good question that I'm actually not entirely sure the answer to. The OR ending on a name like this often indicates, it's called an agentive ending. It means that you slap it onto the end of a verb to indicate one who does blank. What I'm blanking on right now is what the meant part would mean. Because I could be wrong about this. I don't think it necessarily has a mental sort of component to it, because the term that mental comes from, mens mentis, is Latin. It comes from the Roman side, which is a lot later. In terms of Greek, I would actually have to do a little bit of dictionary work and get back to you on that question. But
like in terms of like mentoring, like guiding or what have you.
Right, something like that. I would just have to take a look at my dictionary and see if I could figure out where that came from. But I'd be surprised if I couldn't find something, because the names in the Odyssey are always very carefully crafted. Even in the Iliad as well. I mean, the name Achilles, for example, seems to derive from the term akos, which means grief or lament. So Achilles as the guy who grieves, laments when Patroclus dies, right? So names are always names are usually significant. Let me take that back a little bit. Usually significant, and I'll do a little bit of dictionary work to answer that question for you.
I would also imagine that like the significance of the name is probably at least partially tied to the importance of the character.
Absolutely.
So, you know,
true.
one-off type of people who you're going to encounter once and kind of forget about may have kind of funny significant names, but the main characters in any one of these given stories is probably going to have at least some significance to the name that they were given. I will be really interested to hear if you're able to dig anything up, but obviously no pressure on that.
Sure.
We'll just ask it every episode in case you forget.
Sure.
I personally will not, but I will leave it to Wriste to absolutely do that. And then just as he has done to me, I will say we're not supposed to do that.
Sounds like a plan.
However, I think this is actually kind of a lovely place to wrap up our discussion on book 2. This has been a pleasure as always having you on, Dr. Daniel, Dr. Dan the man.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you once again for joining us. It really has been just a joy to have you on.
Thank you for having me. Again, I love talking about these works. I love sharing my love for classics with everyone. So, and I love hearing what the two of you have to say about these amazing works.
Absolutely. Wriste, any other final thoughts?
When you said this has been a great time, I was just, my mind went to fill it in with "This has been Silly Songs with Larry," part of the show where Larry comes out to sing a silly song.
That is a wonderful last thought.
A glimpse into my childhood.
Amazing.
I I like that. I'm not sure that we've gotten many of those. I know we've gotten a couple, but that was fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. This is usually, once again, this is usually the place where we would tell you to stick around and listen to Dr. Dan's tag after the episode, but he's here with us right now.
Hello.
And we've had a wonderful conversation, and I don't think there's much more that we could add on to it. So instead, I will bid you all adieu, and we will see you next time on Homeward Bound, when we will be discussing books 3 and 4 of the Odyssey. Have a good one, folks.